Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you here on a cold morning, for a discussion of a topic that's clearly becoming more and more important. When Jim Demink sat down, he said, "Gee, you picked your timing well." I don't think I don't think we really picked it. I think that um, every day when you open the papers, it seems to be the number one on the international news, and it's a rather distressing story that we're reading. So I'm delighted that Jonathan Spire is here this morning to give his perspective on all this. Jonathan's currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Global Research and International Affairs at the Interdisciplinary Centre in Herzliya, Israel. He's a former official of the Israel Government Press Office and has served as a special advisor on international affairs to Israeli cabinet ministers. His specialisation is in the field of Israeli foreign policy, the Arab-Israel conflict, and the political history of Israel. Dr. Spire also lectures on the new anti-Semitism in Europe and in the Middle East, Islamist ideologies and movements, and political trends in the Middle East. He's received international media attention recently for his on-the-spot reporting from Syria and Lebanon, and for his very well-received book, The Transforming Fire, Tracing the Israel Islamist Conflict. He received his PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and his MSc in Modern Politics of the Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Born in Britain, he's lived in Israel for the past 22 years. His analysis of Israel and broader regional events and processes has been published in major journals in Israel and abroad, including The Guardian, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, and the Middle Eastern Review of International Affairs. He has many book chapters on Middle East issues, and the co-author of The Rise of Nationalism, the Arab World, The Rise of Nationalism, the Arab World, Turkey and Iran, and Israel at 50, History and Economy. He acts as a consultant to a wide variety of bodies in the academic, non-governmental, media and public affairs field. He's in Australia as a guest of the Australian Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, and our two friends over here from there, and we're very grateful for them yet again for making available one of their speakers for an event at CIS. Jonathan's also visited Canberra, and he's going to Perth and Melbourne. So again, it is timely, and what we'll do, he'll talk for about 20-25 minutes or so, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion, and you can then, when that's all over, you can get off to work. So please welcome Jonathan Spire.
Thanks. Well, good morning, and it's very nice to get the chance to address you here, and I look forward very much to our discussion. I'll get straight to it, since I know that we are limited somewhat in terms of time. What I want to do in the following 25 minutes or so is really four things. I want to first of all look at the current situation in Syria and where things stand and how they got to where things currently are. I'd like to observe the balance of power between the regime and the rebels. I want to look at the international support or absence of support for each of the sides. And finally, to attempt some speculation and a very tiny bit of advocacy regarding the chances for regime survival, or conversely, a successful toppling of the Assad regime. To get straight to the first point then, well, regarding the current state of events, the Assad regime, having famously declared itself immune from the Arab Spring, in a well-known interview which President Assad gave to the Wall Street Journal on January 31st of last year, went into great detail as to why there had not been an uprising in Syria and why there would not be an uprising in Syria in his considered opinion. Having declared himself immune, the regime was caught badly unawares by the outbreak of large-scale protests in the southern Syrian town of Dara in March 2011. Having made some rather ham-fisted initial attempts to placate protesters, and we remember first of all the sacking of the unfortunate Mr. Faisal Khaltoum, the then governor of Dara, the granting of nationality to thousands of Syrian-born Kurds, the scrapping of a ruling that banned teachers from wearing the Islamic niqab dress, and finally the rescinding of emergency laws in place since 1963. Having made these initial and unsuccessful, of course, attempts to placate the protesters, the regime in mid-April 2011 changed direction, went into a situation of frontal confrontation with the protests against it, and this stance has effectively continued from last April up until today, nearly 14 months later. Between 11 and 12,000 people are now dead as a result of this stance. Tens of thousands have become refugees in Turkey and Lebanon. Unknown numbers are in regime custody. The pattern on the ground has now become clear. The revolt is taking place in certain specific areas of the country. The regime places areas in revolt under closure and then moves in to try to pacify them. The armed element of the rebels withdraws. The civilian population of the area in question is then left to bear the brunt of the retribution that follows. But when the regime moves on from the area in question, the rebellion reignites, meaning that neither side currently can deliver the fatal blow to the other. The initiative in this ongoing contest has ebbed and flowed between regime and opposition in the course of the last year. And I'd like to just go on now to focus a little bit to observe the most important trends or events in that ebbing and flowing. Well, starting in late 2011, following months of demonstration and repression, the opposition and the Free Syrian Army, the armed element among the opposition, began to establish a precarious control over a number of areas of Syria. First to come under rebel control were a number of towns and villages in Idlib province, near the Turkish border. And later in January 2012, the Free Syrian Army managed to take control of the town of Zabadani in Damascus province. On 21st of January, the FSA took the town of Douma, near Damascus. For 3 months, famously, the FSA took control of the city of Homs in central Syria. And in January, even some Damascus suburbs of the city of Damascus fell under partial and precarious opposition control. Once under rebel control, the regime ceases effectively to exist in the area in question, at least visibly. But of course, this control was vulnerable in the extreme. The FSA were clear that they would be quite incapable of holding ground against a frontal attempt by the regime to retake the areas in question. And indeed, in February 2012, the Assad regime began a concerted counterattack, an attempt to systematically reconquer rebel-held areas. It began by retaking Douma in the area of Damascus. It moved on to Homs, and of course we remember the dreadful scenes in Homs, which led to the deaths of the 2 journalists, Marie Colvin and her colleague, and destruction of enormous amount of life and property there. And following the pacification successfully of Homs, the regime then moved on to Idlib province and began to systematically move through the northern center of the uprising in Idlib in time for the beginning of the so-called ceasefire beginning on April 10th, 2012. Well, Human Rights Watch recently released a report based on some very courageous field research undertaken by some of their staff in Idlib province prior to the ceasefire of April 10th, looking into detail as to what exactly took place. And I think it paints a very graphic picture, their research. It's available online for free, as to what exactly is going on in Syria, specifically as to the regime's retribution, often carried out by the Alawi irregular forces who side with it. The report describes how 95 civilians died and hundreds were wounded in the period between March 22nd and April 6th, as Syrian armor and infantry swept methodically through the towns of Saramin, Sarakib, Taftanaz, Hazano and Kili. The report described, for example, the execution of 19 members of a single family, the Ghazals of Taftanaz, on a single day, April 3rd. Similar actions to these have taken place throughout the country in the areas affected by the uprising, in Homs, Hama, Idlib, Dir al-Zor, Rastan, Douma near Damascus, and of course, latterly Hula, 40 miles from Homs, in the last few days. These pacifications involve the use of helicopters, artillery and armor against civilians, large-scale roundups, disappearances, and many deaths. But once again, to reiterate it, as has become apparent, the regime does not have sufficient wherewithal to place all areas in revolt under permanent occupation. which means that when the armed forces move on, the uprising re-emerges. Which means that Syria is now in a state of civil war, with the two sides grossly mismatched and much depending on the international response. Let me then turn to look in a little bit of detail at the opposing forces in this contest. First of all at the regime, and then we'll have a quick look at the rebels themselves. The Bashar al-Assad regime has succeeded in maintaining, at least up till now, the minimum key elements required for its survival. The political circle around the president has seen no major defections since the start of the uprising. No top-level ministers, no top-level army chiefs have yet gone over to the rebels. The Syrian Arab Army, that's the official name of Assad's forces, notionally numbers 220,000 troops in 12 divisions plus an additional 280,000 reserves. This army has hemorrhaged manpower since the start of the uprising through desertions. There are those who consider it's now down to around 70,000 loyal men. But of course, the regime does not require the entirety of this large force to secure its existence. Rather, it depends on a certain number of loyal units for its defense against its own people, so to speak. And these are the Republican Guard, the famous 4th Armored Division, which people have been reading about, I'm sure, in the last weeks, the Special Forces. All of these forces are overwhelmingly Alawi in ethnic complexion. They're the best trained and equipped of all the forces in the army, and they have remained, to a man, up until now at least, loyal to the regime. In addition to these divisions, the regime maintains a force of an estimated 60 to 70,000 armed Alawi irregulars, known as the Shabikha. In Arabic it means the ghosts. The internal security forces, the internal intelligence forces, also play a key role in maintaining fear of the regime in areas outside of the hotbed of the rebellion. Syria has 4 security directorates: military intelligence, air force intelligence, state security, and political security. In all thought to number around 65,000 full-time employees, with of course a vastly larger network of agents and informers throughout the country. So bottom line, Assad's security structures remain standing and remain currently adequate for the defense of his regime. In terms of its domestic standing, the regime maintains the support of the 12% Alawi minority in an uprising which is taking on more and more clearly sectarian tones with each week that goes by. The 10% Christian minority in Syria and the 10 to 15% Kurdish ethnic minority have also stayed largely outside of the uprising. They don't wish to become involved in what one Kurdish Syrian friend of mine described to me as a battle between the Alawi regime on the one hand and the Turks and the Muslim Brothers on the other. Assad also depends on the acquiescence of the Sunni middle and merchant class in the key cities of Damascus and Aleppo. This, of course, has frayed in recent weeks, and people have probably noted the demonstrations that have taken place in Aleppo. But it's not broken. It's frayed, it's fading perhaps, but it's still in existence. Which means that the Assad regime, while severely stretched, shows no signs currently of collapse or of impending collapse. What of the rebels? The Syrian opposition has found difficulty in uniting, and a single opposition framework able to bring together the various disparate elements of the Syrian opposition does not yet exist. The main external opposition body today is the Syrian National Council, led, at least until recently, nobody's quite sure if he still leads it or not, by the former Sorbonne professor Burhan Ghaliun. It's headquartered in Istanbul, Turkey. The reason why no one's quite sure is because Ghaliun keeps rendering his resignation, and then no one's quite sure if he withdraws it or he resigns, but then a week later you find he's just kind of still there, so it's not quite clear. Additional elements which we need to quickly consider are the network of local coordination committees and revolutionary councils within Syria, which are generally seen as loosely and problematically associated with the SNC, the Syrian National Council. There's the national coordinating body too, a rival would-be umbrella group for the opposition, and of course there is the armed element, the Free Syrian Army, and those around it. Well, the SNC was formed on August 23rd, 2011, as a coalition of 7 opposition groups under Turkish tutelage and with a heavy presence of the Muslim Brotherhood in its ruling council. It has been beset from the outset by claims that it represents no one or hardly anyone in Syria itself, by claims that it was in fact a front for the Muslim Brothers, and by squabbling among its various constituent groups. It has failed signally to attract the membership of minorities, particularly the Kurds. It has failed to seal the loyalty of the armed element, the Free Syrian Army, and it's failed even to keep the loyalty of the local coordinating committees who joined it and are currently threatening to resign from it. So it has failed, in short, to become the united body for the Syrian revolution, which it was set up in order to become. The NCB, the National Coordinating Body, is a far less significant force consisting of 13 leftist parties, all of whom are opposed to external intervention in Syria and who are therefore regarded by other opposition groups as collaborationist. The uprising also, of course, has an armed element. The Free Syrian Army was formed in July 2011 by former Air Force Colonel Riyad Assad. I spent a week embedded, I suppose you could call it, with the Free Syrian Army in Idlib province in late February, and trying to get a sense of what this force was all about. And the bottom line, which I and others quickly noted, was that despite the name and the notional command in Antalya, Turkey, this army consists for the most part of a loose conglomeration of armed initiatives centered around local power structures in various parts of the country. The members of these structures include both recent army deserters, famously, but also a large number of civilians who've decided to take up arms against the regime. A number of high-ranking officers have gone over to this army, most well-known being General Mustafa Ahmed al-Sheikh of the army, who came over in January 2012. At least one other general is thought to have come over. The strategy of the FSA is problematic and hard entirely to discern the clarity of it. Initially, it saw its goal as modest, as protecting demonstrators. But it's recently broadened this sense, and al-Sheikh was quoted on 12th of January 2012 in the following words. This is al-Sheikh I'm quoting. "If we get 25,000 to 30,000 deserters mounting guerrilla warfare in small groups of 6 or 7, it is enough to exhaust the army in a year to a year and a half, even if they, the guerrillas that is, are armed only with rocket-propelled grenades and light weapons." This strategy was repeated to me by a number of officers in Antakya and within Syria in interviews which I conducted. It is, of course, highly questionable as to whether this strategy is workable at all, or indeed whether the FSA has the ability to pursue a coherent nationwide strategy of any kind, given the divisions within it. The FSA claims to number 70,000 fighters. It probably, in fact, has between 20 and 30,000 active in specific parts of the country, the largest concentration being in the central region, Hama and Homs and the surrounding areas. So the opposition has clear structures. It's determined and it's proven that it's capable of absorbing blows and continuing, but it remains severely stymied by the very notable absence of unity in its ranks. What then of the international response and assistance to the two sides? And this seems to me to be the crucial element in looking and understanding at where things stand in Syria right now. The Assad regime has benefited and has probably survived as a result of the firm and united backing of its international allies, above all Russia and Iran. Syria, of course, is a central member of the Iran-led regional alliance. Iran is playing a powerful and active role in looking after its ally, and much evidence has emerged to support this. I'm not going to go through the full list of evidence which I have as part of this piece of work which I'm presenting to you, but just to give you an example, as early as April 14th, 2011, Victoria Nuland of the State Department accused Tehran of providing the Syrian authorities with know-how for monitoring and shutting down communications by activists, and a large amount of subsequent evidence has emerged. A classified United Nations report that was leaked stated that Iran was covertly shipping arms to Syria in violation of international sanctions. It identified 9 specific incidents of transfer of weapons. the US Treasury Department has officially sanctioned Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani for his role in the transfer of arms. And these allegations have been borne out by both eyewitness reports and by footage publicly available, obtained of Iranians captured and held by the opposition, and of Iranian equipment. All of this to be found very easily on YouTube or elsewhere on the internet. Iranian aid has also taken financial form, and one source has said that around $2 billion has been provided over the last year by the regime, to the Iranian regime, to its Syrian friends. And of course the various proxies of Iran have also been mobilized visibly to help out. The Hezbollah organization, above all, in neighboring Lebanon. We are told also the Muqtada al-Sadr organization from Iraq has also been mobilized. So the Iran-led regional alliance, so to speak, to use a term from basketball, is currently engaged in what might be called a full court press on behalf of its troubled friend in Damascus. Russia too has been aiding Assad overtly and covertly since the outbreak of the uprising. Russian support, of course, has been most notable in international forums, particularly in preventing a coherent international response to events in Syria via the United Nations Security Council. And Russian aid to the regime in terms of arms has also been substantial. It's important to understand that this Russian aid has very clear logical basis behind it. Russia is very, very heavily economically invested in the Assad regime. Between 2007 and 2011, imports from Russia accounted for 78% of all Syrian arms imports. A remaining 17% came from Belarus, which means if we can think about Russia and Belarus, in essence, when it comes to arms sales as a single unit, 95% of Syrian arms purchases are coming from Russia and its satellites. Russian companies also heavily engaged in infrastructure projects in Syria, the search for oil and gas. A total amount of investment in the year 2009 of $19.4 billion. There is, of course, also a strategic element from the Russian point of view, and people here, I'm sure, are familiar with the naval base in Tartus, the only base which the Russian Navy maintains in the Mediterranean, giving them the capability to operate in the Mediterranean itself, to reach the Red Sea via the Suez Canal, and to reach the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar in short time. If Tartus goes, and if Assad falls, it will go, because the rebels are angry with many people, but they're angry with Russia above all others, as far as I have made out. Then the next base along from the Russian point of view is Sevastopol on the Black Sea, a long, long way away from the Mediterranean, and therefore not nearly as serious an asset. So armed ships loaded with weaponry for this regime are leaving the port of Oktyabrsky in southern Ukraine on a weekly basis. They are bringing weaponry, crossing through the Straits of through the Bosphorus to Limassol in Cyprus, up to Tartus in Syria. This is the lifeblood of the Assad regime currently. Which means that behind Assad stands a determined international coalition pledged to keeping him in power by all means available. The Western response, of course, has been very different in nature. The US administration clearly wanted and wants to avoid any direct involvement in Syria. And as a result, throughout 2011, policy has appeared rudderless, with Washington tentatively trying out a variety of options and then abandoning them. Not until August did President Obama even openly call on President Assad to resign. The US sought first of all to rely on Turkey, but Turkey made clear that while it was prepared to sponsor and domicile the Syrian opposition and the FSA, it would take no unilateral steps without UNSC, Security Council, backing. Sanctions were incrementally increased in the course of the year. They've certainly had an impact on the Syrian economy, a very serious basis. This has come nowhere close to changing policy. And of course, two abortive international plans for international mediation have taken place. First of all, last summer, you'll remember the strange and rather surreal dispatch of Arab League observers to Syria. Strange and rather surreal, first of all, because of their very small number, but secondly, and more interestingly or amusingly for those of a cynical bent, they were led by a man called General Mustafa al-Darbi of Sudan, who is himself a suspected war criminal. In any case, they, of course, failed to get anywhere and were rapidly withdrawn. For some reason, the United Nations Security Council chose to repeat the experiment and is currently repeating the experiment, this time with 250 UN observers under Major General the Norwegian Major General Robert Mood, a man who I know personally because he spent a lot of time in Israel and who is a very, very serious fellow and worthy of our respect. But having said that, clearly under the provision of his mission, with 250 men across the country, men and women across the country, there is no chance whatsoever of this mission getting anywhere, and indeed it is having very, very little impact on the ground. This tepid nature of the Western response may now be altering to a degree. The latest indications are that the West and Arab states have realized that sponsoring the squabbling external opposition is getting nowhere, and we learn from the Washington Post in a number of fascinating recent articles that money and arms are now, we are told, being made available directly to elements within Syria. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are playing the central role, and we are told at least that the Americans are on the ground helping to identify deserving elements. Let me just move rapidly to some conclusions, and then we'll move on to our discussion. Bottom line, Syria's alignment with Iran and with Russia is paying dividends. Through that alliance, over the last decade, Damascus managed to magnify its external and regional influence, but it's now clear that this policy made sense in other ways too. This alignment represents Assad's best chance of survival, because Western hesitancy to confront Iran and its allies and Russia is the crucial factor making possible the current crackdown underway. And if we think of the history of the Arab Spring over the last year, we note, and the region notes too, that the pro-Western Arab authoritarian rulers, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, were forced aside rapidly by a combination of internal and subsequent Western pressure. Assad, by contrast, who is aligned with the coalition of anti-Western states and movements in the region, led by Iran, has faced only minor Western pressure and is currently getting away, therefore, with murdering thousands of his own people because, bottom line, of Western desire to disengage from the region, fear of Iran and its proxies, fear of Russia, and, of course, the active Iranian and Russian assistance which is taking place. If Assad survives, then, it will mean that the Arab Spring in the main countries of the Arab world will offer a near-perfect lesson to regional political elites regarding who it is worth aligning with. Pro-Western Mubarak was abandoned and rapidly fell. Pro-Iranian Syria will have dug in, been helped enormously by its Iranian and Russian patrons, and prevailed. This will represent a major defeat for the West and its allies in the region. Let me just conclude by saying, by predicting a little bit the following. Absent increased external pressure, Bashar is likely to survive, for quite a while at least. The effort to bring him down is likely to be a marathon rather than a swiftly concluded contest. There's little or no likelihood of military action, of course, by the West, but at the very least, and here's my little bit of advocacy that I promised you, other forms of pressure can and should be applied. Increased covert support for the rebels, perhaps support for the establishment of the famous buffer zone or no-fly zone, perhaps a no-heavy armor zone in the north of Syria. Civil war is underway in Syria. This war sees Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and to a much lesser extent the US supporting one or other of the sides. It is a war with increasingly sectarian overtones. It looks like having a long time to run. It has already consumed 12,000 lives. Its outcome, and on this I'll conclude, will be of vast importance, not only for the people of Syria themselves, but also for the future balance and strategic direction of the Middle East as a whole. And on that note, I will now be quiet, and I'll be happy to take your questions and comments. Thank you.
How do you explain the difference of the Russian position in the case of Libya and in the case of Syria?
Yeah, interesting question. Well, the answer is because the level of investment, both of an economic and of a strategic nature, is entirely different, of course, with vis-a-vis Libya and vis-a-vis Syria. Libya, a country which was effectively friendless at the time that it was that the regime, Gaddafi regime, was brought down, and therefore was ripe for picking by any coalition that wanted to go in there. And Syria, on the contrary, has friends, and Russia is, unlike in Libya, deeply invested in the country, both in economic terms and in strategic terms. And for this reason, there's no the comparison, is hard to make. Russia, it's really important not to underestimate the extent and the longevity of the Russian strategic investment in Syria. Of course, it goes way back to Soviet days. It goes back, in essence, to the 1960s, to the first emergence of anti-Western governments in Syria. And ever since then, their main ally has been Russia, and they've played an important role for the Russians for a number of reasons. Russia has always liked to have a spoiler, so to speak, in what it regards as the West's strategic backyard, and that's how it regards the Levant. And the Assad regime has been perfectly placed for playing that role. It was quite happy to create problems and then to offer itself as the solution to those problems. That was the way it liked to punch above its weight in the region. So it was kind of a marriage made in heaven, or perhaps made in hell, between the Russian interest in having a spoiler and the Assad regime, for its own reasons, in playing precisely that role. That's the way it's been all the way through, and it's produced dividends for the Russians, and so they're very keen to keep it going. The Tartus naval aspect also shouldn't be forgotten. And the last aspect, I think, to bear in mind is that Russian support, in the end, kind of provides its own logic for its continuation, because by doubling down on support for Assad, as they've done over the last year, the Russians have kind of reduced their alternatives, because, as I sort of hinted at during the talk, the level of anti-Russian feeling among the anti-Assad elements in Syria is huge. And so they now know that if Assad falls, and if these rebels come to power, then Russia is going to be out of Syria for a long time to come. So the commitment kind of creates a logic for its own continuation by the extent and keenness to which the Russians have pursued it over the last year.
Thank you. The opportunities and threats for Israel, what are they?
Yeah, fascinatingly, there has been pretty much a 180-degree turn over the last year in the view of the Israeli security and policy establishment with regard to Syria. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with where that stood prior to the Syrian uprising, but it's fascinating because the not unanimous, but the overwhelming view of Syria, of Assad regime in Syria, held by the Israeli establishment prior to March 2011, was that Assad was a rational actor, that Assad may well in many ways be an asset for Israel, and that Assad's alliance with Iran and with the anti-Israel axis in the region, so to speak, was tenuous, because the man himself was secular, not an Islamist regime, and that therefore Israel should be well advised to do all it could to tempt this guy away from the pro-Iranian axis back over to the pro-American axis through proposed concessions and the rest of it. I was one of those in Israel who always thought that view was absolute nonsense from start to finish, and I expressed that when I could in the forums which I'm invited to, or which I'm part of, and I was told that I was naive or didn't quite get it, and so on and so forth. Well, Assad is very lucky that he didn't take the advice of his would-be advisor Alon Liel or the other members of the Israeli security establishment who wanted to pull him over to the pro-American side in the region. Had he been pulled over to the pro-American side, he'd be where, if he was lucky, where Hosni Mubarak is now in a cage, and if he was unlucky, where Muammar Gaddafi is now 6 foot under the ground. As opposed to which he still has his job and he still has his chair. So he was lucky he didn't take the advice of his Israeli would-be friends. Well, the view of the Israeli security establishment has now gone 180 degrees. The prevailing opinion you now hear is, of course, that Assad cannot and will never be an asset for Israel or a potential ally for the West in the region, and that therefore it would be to Israel's benefit if he fell. Now, this is something which has to be considered carefully, of course, because the anti-Assad elements in Syria are by no means friendly to Israel, to put it mildly, and are likely to be aligned, if they come to power, with the Sunni Arab countries. So how then does this view, which I agree with, by the way, which the Israeli establishment now holds, how does it make sense? The way it makes sense, I think, is in the following way. They say, look, the most important and powerful and potent anti-Israel force in the region is the regional axis led by Iran, of which Bashar Assad is a key element. If he falls, a Sunni government of one kind or another is likely to come to power in Syria. This will enormously weaken Israel's most potent non-state enemy in the region, namely the Hezbollah organization in Lebanon. The Hezbollah organization in Lebanon, if Assad falls and the Sunnis take his place, instead of having a friendly, non-Sunni, Iran-aligned country next door to which they can escape when necessary, which can fuel Iranian arms and money to them. Instead of that, it will have an alien Sunni power next door, which will probably be very angry with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is currently aiding Assad, and which will therefore do all its best to weaken Hezbollah's position in Lebanon. This, from Israel's point of view, is a net gain. It's worth noting the difference in nature of the Sunni Arab opposition to Israel right now compared with that of the Iran-led Shia axis. The Iranians mean it, and their friends mean it. They mean it, and they put their money where their mouth is in terms of weaponry and in terms of blood and in terms of armed action against Israel. Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and their various other clients. And of course the Iranian nuclear ambition standing behind that. The Sunni Arabs, it's very different. With the Saudis, with the Qataris, of course their newspapers and media and educational systems pump out anti-Israel and sometimes anti-Jewish language. But when it comes to actual strategic interests, these countries are aligned in one way or another with the West in the region. Which means that if we were to get something similar to Qatar, not in economic terms, but in terms of its stance vis-a-vis Israel and the West to emerge in Syria, that wouldn't be wonderful. It would be much nicer to have a Democrat who would be our friend, but it would be certainly a great deal better than Bashar Assad. Even if it was something worse than that, even if it was a more radical Sunni regime, it was going to be nowhere near the level of organization and commitment to which the Iranians and their friends have, because we just don't see any evidence of that among the Sunnis in the region. So in short, from an Israeli point of view, the considered opinion of the establishment, which I think is correct, is that Assad's fall would probably benefit Israel, and even if it did not, it would certainly weaken in one way or another the Iran-led regional access and would not produce a regime a great deal worse than the Assad regime in terms of what it's been for active promotion of anti-Israel activity in the region.
What you've just illustrated is that nobody seems to care too much about the Syrian people themselves. The Russians, have got their proxy, and Israel's, trying to figure out what's in its interest. I mean, taking in a similar way, what about the US? I mean, how important is it for the US for there to be regime change, and is that good for them vis-a-vis Iran or whatever? I mean, if the US is going to act, it will only again be in its interest to do so.
First of all, the first point you make is well taken, because we should be aware of the humanitarian aspect of this, and we shouldn't forget it, even if realpolitik in the end has to perhaps will take precedent in terms of government decision making. This is a human population who are suffering dreadfully, and as I said, I was in northern Syria in late February, and to see a civilian population whose own army, so to speak, appears to have declared war on it, which is really the reality of what's happening in Syria right now, is quite a terrifying and strange thing to witness, and we certainly should, I think, keep that in our minds when we're considering this. In terms of the United States' interest, well, it depends on who you ask. I mean, certainly it seems to me, if you want my opinion, that yes, should Assad fall, this would be in the American interest, because of course there is, in the end, the Iran-led regional axis, its main enemy and its main opponent is the United States. It's not Israel. Israel may be the country it likes to talk rhetorically about, but the real, actual, physical enemy who it wishes to replace as the most powerful force in the region is that of the United States and its various allies. So any weakening of the Assad regime would correspondingly, of the Iran-led regional axis rather, through the fall of the Assad regime, would correspondingly be good for the Americans. The problem is that if one looks at the actual policy-making circles currently running United States foreign policy, I don't think that level of clarity, frankly, exists. And the zigzagging that has taken place in American policy over the last year, has to be studied to be believed. There really has been no coherent line of thought whatsoever. There was the desire to contract it out to the Turks, and when that didn't work, there was contracted out to the Arab League, contracted out to the UN Security Council now, to the Robert Mood and his poor 250 UN observers. What do we gather from all this? I think what we gather from it is that the only coherent thread I can find is that this United States administration wants out from the Middle East. It's sick of the region and it wants to disengage from it. It's one of its main selling points to the American people, so to speak, is we've had two unsuccessful or relatively unsuccessful engagements in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq. We are the ones who are trying to end that. There's no desire at all, therefore, to say, but by the way, we're getting us re-involved in another one up here close to the Mediterranean Sea. They want out. The problem is that it ain't going to work. And the reason why it's not going to work, in my humble opinion, is because the people they are trying to contract out the work to just aren't made for producing results, or at least not results that are good for the West. Right? You contract out the work to Turkey, you get what Erdogan wants you to get. If you want Turkey to create a Syrian political opposition, don't be surprised if you get an opposition in which the Muslim Brotherhood are massively overrepresented. It shouldn't surprise you. That's the people that Erdogan likes. Right? If you contract out the job of creating an armed opposition to Assad, to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, don't be surprised if you get a Sunni Islamist armed opposition going on against Assad, because those are the people that those guys understand and like, and that's who they're going to back. And that's effectively what's going on. I think America has taken its hand off the wheel, so to speak, and the people whose hands it's put on the wheel are not going to take the vehicle in a direction good for Western interests.
What about Europe? They've got long historic links in Syria, and they were involved in Lebanon, in Libya. Are they also tired and withdrawing?
The French, in particular, of course, have always regarded Syria and Lebanon as their particular interest. Very, very long historical involvement in that area, and Sarkozy, to his credit, was among the first of Western leaders to speak in very strong terms against Assad and against the continuation of his rule. The problem is, vis-a-vis the Europeans and Syria, the same as the problem vis-a-vis the Europeans and everywhere else in the Middle East, which is that they can talk as much as they want, they can perhaps put money into a situation, but that's pretty much where it begins and ends. Europe cannot project power in the Middle East because, as we know, the Europeans have chosen to, over the last half century, so to speak, have chosen to put themselves in a position where they are incapable of projecting power because they haven't created the assets that enable you to project power. Now, I speak to a lot of European diplomats at the various rep offices in Jerusalem and Ramallah, and you encounter this frustration in the Israeli-Palestinian context, all the time, because there the Europeans have poured in massive amounts of money to the Palestinian Authority, and they trade closely with Israel also. And the diplomats are constantly sort of banging their head against the wall, saying, "Well, why can't we manage to turn? Why does everyone ignore us when it comes to the high table stuff? When it comes to the actual diplomacy and the actual politics?" And the answer is, people ignore you because they can. Right? People are going to say, "Well, why do I have to listen to you?" They go, "No, I don't have to say. You know what? Yeah, say what you want. Thank you very much." That's how it is in the Israeli-Palestinian context, as you are all aware. And that is also how it would be in the Syrian context if the Europeans were to start to try and get really involved. Ultimately, the only Western power, of course, capable of doing heavy lifting in the Middle East is the United States of America. That's where it begins and ends, which means when the Americans aren't there, other people start to get involved, but the other people do not include the European Union because it just can't, it doesn't have the ability to get involved. It means powers such as Russia or regional powers such as Turkey. Those are the ones one has to take into account if a void is left. The Europeans can't fill the void. They don't have the capability. They've chosen not to have the capability to do so.
If we go back 100 years, we've got exactly the same situation with the Arab Revolt, where the protagonist was the Ottoman Empire at that time. And the major problem that the British found was the fragmentation within Syria in terms of the huge number, and we don't see it ever in the media at all, of ethnic, tribal, religious divisions which don't allow them actually to work together. And T. Lawrence said, power starts at the family, the father and the son. The son obeys the father because of fear, and if you multiply that up to the regime, you have exactly the same situation. So it's always been fear that controls, and then it becomes a power play. But we haven't ever really looked at this fragmentation, and I haven't ever seen anything in the press that talks about what really is Syria. Who are they? And where do they come from? And how do they get to where they are?
No, I completely agree with you, and I think that this is something which we can't afford not to notice in looking at Syria, and crucially the way it differs from, for example, Egypt or Tunisia, or indeed Libya, for that matter. Namely, that it is an immensely heterogeneous and pluralist well, pluralist is the wrong word, right, because that means that they're being nice about it, but heterogeneous society, in which, and this is crucially important to remember, Sunni Arabs, that is the people who are, of course, the vast majority in Egypt and in Libya and throughout in Tunisia and elsewhere, Sunni Arabs only constitute around 60% of the population of Syria. And they, of course, constitute the backbone of the uprising against Assad. But they're only just over half of the population, and the rest of the population is a kaleidoscope of different ethnic and sectarian interests and groups, all of whom are either agnostic vis-a-vis the uprising against Assad, or they are, in the case of the 12% Alawi minority, actively invested in the survival of the regime. And this is very, very important to note. And when I was in Antakya, in southern Turkey, a couple of months ago before I went into Syria, I had the chance to meet some Christian Syrians who'd taken refuge or who were living rather in Antakya. And they were very vociferous about this, that, we don't like this uprising, we don't know what it's going to bring. Assad may have been terrible, but Assad at least kept things quiet and therefore kept things as safe for us as they can perhaps be. Yeah, Assad has ruled with an iron hand, because perhaps there is no other way to keep Syria together. So perhaps if the Sunnis come to power, there will be a similarly strong and centralized regime of one kind or another. I suspect that is the case. The pluralist aspect, or the heterogeneous rather aspect of Syria, is something which we absolutely have to factor into any analysis. And any analysis that fails to do so is not going to get anywhere. There is one set of forecasts, or one potential scenario for Syria, which is worth noting, which is that were Assad to fall, potentially the country could, of course, fragment along these ethnic and sectarian lines. And that's not impossible by any means, and people should bear it in mind, because these ethnic groups, there are identifiable areas of the country with which the various ethnic groups are associated. And one of the possibilities that people have raised is that if Assad felt he were about to fall, you might see an attempt by the Alawis, by the Alawi elements in Syria, to form a sort of enclave for itself in the northwest of the country, close to the Mediterranean coast. So it's something which the ethnic heterogeneity is crucial, and in building scenarios and forecasts, we should also take into account the possibility of the fragmentation of the country as one possibility. Of course, that goes for Iraq and other heterogeneous countries in the region too.
Just one last question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question actually goes to the point that you've just made, which is about the diversity in Syrian society. As you've said earlier, there is growing dedication on the part of the international community for assistance for the Free Syrian Army. The Americans are reportedly providing advice as to who should be given arms and funds. But it strikes me that there is reticence on the part of the international community to become involved in that way, because the fear is that if you support the Free Syrian Army, that will lead to the overthrow of Assad, and that will result in internecine conflict. There will be a huge amount of bloodletting. There will be sectarian violence. To what extent do you think it is likely that there will be a disaster scenario of that kind, that we'll see the overthrow of the Assad regime, and that will be replaced by a scenario which is perhaps even worse, where there is just complete chaos and destruction for a perhaps indefinite period of time?
I think the following, even if there is not Western intervention to bring down the Assad regime, there is going to be chaos and destruction and civil war for a long time to come in Syria, because it's already happening. I mean, a civil war is already underway. It's not that the West is choosing whether to switch one on or not. It's already happening. The question is not whether there'll be a civil war or not. There already is one. The question is whether the West will choose to help to try to direct that process in ways good for itself, because that's the way the realpolitik works, but also hopefully for the good of the Syrian people, or not. If it chooses not to, then the civil war will continue, and it will end in one of two ways, as far as I can see it. Either it will end, perhaps, with the victory of the Assad regime, looking less likely, but who knows? The victory of the Assad regime and his assertion of his authority over the country, in which case there will be a terrible bloodletting, because of course Assad will settle accounts in the inimitable Assad way, and the bloodletting will be all in one direction, but it will be terrible. Or Assad will lose eventually after this long civil war, 2-3 years it could be down the line, or further, and then if the West has not got involved, and if the West has not tried to direct events in one way or another, then almost undoubtedly the insurgency which will at that point take power will be one which will have been built by the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks and the Muslim Brotherhood movement, by the way, which we haven't mentioned, but which is increasingly active in southern Turkey in channeling money and arms to the rebels itself. And at that point, yes, at that point there will be a terrible bloodletting in the other direction. Accounts will be settled against the Alawi community above all others, And if we take Egypt as and Iraq as blueprints, it won't be good for Christians in the region, in that country either. So, you know, even if the West doesn't get involved, then bloodletting becomes more or less certain. If the West does get involved, that doesn't guarantee it won't happen. You know, and it doesn't guarantee that there won't be an Islamist, a strong Islamist element in the uprising. That may just be where the region is at right now, you know, in terms of people's sentiment and the overwhelming sentiment. Absolutely. But what it does mean, at least, is that the West can perhaps at least protect its own interests and do its best, at least, to support those non-Sunni Islamist elements in the uprising, which I can assure you, and you probably know as well, you know, do exist. You know, Syria is not Egypt or Libya. There are many Sunni Muslim Arabs in Syria who are not Islamists, and there are many of those who are also engaged in the uprising, and I've met some of them. And if America were to be involved, it could at least play a role in trying to make sure those people have a seat at the table, at least. If the Saudis and Turks and Qataris have their way, those people won't be at the table and the situation will be worse. So I think also in terms of the human level, but also in terms of the Western strategic level, it makes sense for the West to be there.
Well, I don't think we ended on a positive note there either. So.
I suspect the number one news item internationally in Australian papers are going to be Syria and that part of the world for quite a long while yet. And it's important, I think, for Australians to keep a focus. I was saying earlier when Jonathan first arrived that my father was there in Palestine and Syria in the Second World War, and still it goes on. So I think we've had an extremely informative and wide-ranging discussion and explanation of what is going on. So if you want to reprise it a little later on, hopefully we'll be able to get the video up for you. But on behalf of us all, I'd like to thank Dr. Spire for joining us this morning, and also thank AJEC for making it possible.